Here is Meagan Keim with Your Facts Are Not Safe With Us, Russian Information Operations as Social Engineering.
All right. Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming. So, quick question before I get started. Any Russian operatives out there in the audience? Show of hands? No? Yes? Okay, so can they hear me in Moscow? Is it working? Okay, good. All right, let's get started. So, I'm Meagan Keim. So a little bit about me so you know why I'm talking to you about this issue. I'm a Russian language nerd and InfoSec enthusiast. I spent a year abroad in Russia on a language immersion program in St. Petersburg. While I was over there, I purposely avoided English language news sources. And I did that to try to further my language immersion experience. But the unintended side effect of this was that I was basically blasted by propaganda on a daily basis. While I was over there, the Russians invaded and annexed the Ukrainian peninsula of Crimea and also started military operations in eastern Ukraine. So I'm going to touch on both of those things pretty extensively here. And let's jump right in. So to give you some background on what I'm talking about here, before I talk about it from the perspective of social engineering. So Russian information operations is very insidious for a lot of different reasons. One of them being that a very common tactic is that it'll take a small piece of truth out of its original context and then create a new false narrative around that very small grain of truth. So a good example of this that's relevant to the case study that I'll be discussing later is that the existence of far-right nationalist Ukrainian groups, both current and historical, has been used to paint all Ukrainians as being fascists. So another common tactic here is that Russian information operations pushes expedient narratives and sometimes even creates new realities on the ground. So an example of one of these expedient narratives would be, Russia's no worse than the West. And this is something that I heard, such a common refrain that I became totally numb to it while I was over there. And an example of how this works in practice. So a lot of whataboutism goes on here. So the US supported separatist Kosovo in the Yugoslav wars in the 1990s. And did so with military operations. Now, Russia decided to point this out as supposed hypocrisy because when the Crimean operations started, they were supposed to, the US was supposed to support Crimea's supposed self-determination, even though it was actually an invasion. So another key thing to keep in mind here is that what will often happen is fringe groups will be co-opted to put this disinformation back out and amplify that signal. So another example here, I mentioned the conflict in eastern Ukraine already. So thousands of Russian far-right nationalists decided to volunteer to fight in Ukraine alongside pro-Russian Ukrainian separatists, militants, many different words to refer to them, but the Russians who were fighting in eastern Ukraine always used very specific terminology that was verbatim what the Russian state used to refer to these fighters. So that would be brothers or separatists, even though, again, these were, armed rebels trying to separate from the elected Ukrainian government. So now that you have a basis of understanding here, let's take a step back and talk about this from the perspective of social engineering. So Russian information operations can be seen as large-scale social engineering. So in classic social engineering, behavioral norms or social norms are used to get some kind of personal gain. You all know this, I don't have to tell you this. But in the case of Russian information operations, what's actually being abused here, the vector, is societal norms, and the goal is national gain. So let's take a look at how this works in practice. So again, another key thing to keep in mind is that Russian information operations never refutes facts or narratives. Instead, they erode and subvert Western values. So an example here. Transparency as a value is something that is pretty widely accepted in Western cultures. And this transparency as a value was abused when WikiLeaks was used as a front to dump stolen information and push convenient narratives that the Russian government wanted out there. Now, backing up just a tiny bit, I'm not sure if you can see the logo in those pictures of Mr. Assange, but that is the logo of RT, and I want to definitely highlight RT since it is a really key player in this space. So RT used to be called Russia Today until it went through a very clever rebranding that was intended to hide the fact that Russia owns and operates this outlet. It's the international arm of Kremlin information operations. Now, Russia Today, or RT as it so cleverly calls itself, abuses Western values of freedom of speech and freedom of press when it presents itself as a news source. And it also presents itself as an alternative to the Western media establishment. So the other thing about RT is that there are many, many channels here. So there's an Arabic channel, there's a French channel, there's an outlet based in Washington, D.C. All of these different channels are tailored to specific audiences based on reconnaissance, much like any good social engineer would do. So let's go into a specific case study of the annexation of Crimea to talk about, again, how this works in practice. So while I was over there, this whole crisis started. I saw it unfold. And this is really the first and best example of when Russian military operations and information operations were completely integrated. So what actually happened? The invasion started when Russian soldiers without insignia on their uniforms infiltrated the peninsula of Crimea and took over key choke points, so communications infrastructure, government offices, and military bases. So at the same time, Russia's information operations pushed the claim that these, quote, little green men, or, quote, polite people, were militiamen instead of the Russian soldiers that they were actually in fact. Now, Russian forces were deliberately referred to in this way to make the situation seem less threatening and less urgent. It also made it seem like it was support for a genuine self-determination or independence movement in Crimea, when it was actually, again, an invasion by Russia. So, again, from personal experience, the effects of Russian information operations are extremely, extremely insidious. So I was subjected to daily coverage on state news outlets that painted this whole crisis as a, quote, historic reunion, or a, quote, return to Russia. Now, this language was specifically crafted to appeal to common culture and common history between Ukraine and Russia. Crimea, the peninsula you see in the south there in dark red, was a key destination for Soviet vacationers and also was home to a very important Soviet Navy port. Now, I included this map to show you, again, like how close geographically and also linguistically these invaded regions are to Russia. So the dark red indicates that 75% or more of the population are they're native Russian speakers. Now, the other region in dark red is Donetsk, and that's one of the sources of the conflict in eastern Ukraine. And then also the region to the northeast is Lugansk, and that's the other hotspot in that conflict. So you can see, again, these linguistic ties, the geographical closeness definitely set up this entire operation. So after the infiltration was complete, Russian information operations trumpeted the overwhelming and falsified results of the Russian-organized referendum in Crimea. In that referendum, supposedly 95% of those that voted favored reunification with Russia. So the referendum was a direct subversion of democratic values. As people who value the ability to determine the nature of our own governments, we're primed to think that we should respect this movement for self-determination, for independence. In reality, the entire purpose of this referendum was to legitimize the seizure of territory. And it really, to a large extent, worked, even though there were egregious falsifications, including turnout as high as 123% in some areas. So how did I dig myself out of this thought trap? Actually, sorry, I have to go back. So this whole narrative, the subversion of democratic values, it actually worked on me. I was tempted to think that Russia's claim to Crimea was legitimate through this narrative. I bought it because I was not prepared for this, again, overwhelming information operations and social engineering that abused the value that I assigned to democratic rights. So again, how did I get out of this? How did I, snap out of it? It's all about different ways of thinking. So when you're immersed in a culture for long enough, you develop a lot of different habits, including mental ones. So for me, returning to my home perspective was key. And this happened when I found out about the Budapest Memorandum in a respected Western newspaper. I was reading an article much like what you see on the slide, with a headline similar to "Ukraine pleads for aid as Russia accused of invasion." So a little bit about the Budapest Memorandum so you understand why this snapped me out of it. This is a 1994 treaty between the US, the UK, Russia, and Ukraine. Under this treaty, Ukraine agreed to give up its nuclear arsenal that it had inherited from the USSR. And in exchange, Russia was supposed to respect Ukraine's independence, territorial integrity, and sovereignty. So once I understood this, I realized that the information operations, much like a good social engineer would do on a smaller scale, had tricked me into not questioning the narratives I was consuming, again, by abusing the value I assigned to democratic rights. And this led to my initial failure to recognize the narratives as a cover for breaking international law and as an effort to undermine the international community's ability to respond. So I've already hinted a little bit at this, but I wanted to go through some of the targets of Russian social engineering of this type. So the first set of targets are definitely foreign policymakers and leaders of Western states. In the case of Crimea, Russia obfuscated its real goal, which was keeping Ukraine from leaving its sphere of influence. Russia accomplished this by pushing the little green men narrative that I already talked about. And this narrative made it difficult to respond quickly and effectively. You can't really counter what you can't definitively identify, after all. So social engineering worked on policymakers in the early days of the crisis. It prevented meaningful action until after the fact. This allowed for creation of new reality on the ground that is proven impossible to roll back. The invasion has been accepted as de facto reality with very little consequence to Russia. Of course, there are economic sanctions in place, but the will to maintain those sanctions or make them strong enough to have a real effect has definitely waxed and waned. Another set of targets are mass groups of citizens. And it's important to keep in mind here that no society is safe from these techniques. All societies have values, and therefore those values can be vectors of abuse. In the case of Crimea, Russian info ops shaped Russian public opinion to be overwhelmingly in support of the annexation. My host mom was a great example of this. She, along with the vast majority of Russians, bought into narratives designed specifically for domestic consumption. She would say things like, "Crimea has always been Russian," or "Ukrainians and Russians are one people." So this can seem like a really sort of benign call for unity, but really what this is an implication that Ukraine is somehow not a legitimate sovereign state. And that's something that was actually literally a talking point on the Russian news that I've talked about. The most prominent narrative, again, was this fascism talking point, though, and this triggers visceral memories of World War II for Russians, very strong fears, and also invokes a moral cause of saving the Russian-speaking brethren who they're not under any real threat in reality. So this and other narratives abused Russians' value of collectivism and convinced citizens to support the annexation that was actually against their best interests. The annexation led to astronomical federal spending at a time when the economy was in decline and the federal revenues were also in decline. So in this picture, you can see this is a rally in support of the annexation. It says "Мы вместе," which means we are together. And again, this abuses this value of collectivism, of the group well-being as being above the individual. So now that we have a better understanding of the problem, I want to go through some of the potential mitigation strategies, particularly ones that have already been used in the past. So there's an over-reliance on debunking or fact-checking, but that's really not going to solve the problem. In fact, it ends up exposing more people to the false narrative. And people are, in general, very reluctant to question their own beliefs, especially ones that are deeply held, like political beliefs, for example. And it's also important to keep in mind that the Russian government is really not playing on this level of the fact-checking. They don't care about facts. They don't care about right versus wrong or correct or incorrect. It's all about trying to convince people that none of it matters and to make people apathetic. Well, and that's very convenient for them because apathetic people don't really question the information they're consuming. So another common strategy, putting out counter-narratives, is also problematic. You can end up adding to the problem by becoming propaganda yourself. And when you put out another narrative, it doesn't really get rid of the original one. In fact, it just muddies the waters and makes it more difficult for people to distinguish what is real, what is true, and what is not. And people, again, stop caring to make that distinction. So there is no one easy silver bullet solution to this problem. It's very complicated and very, very massive. However, there can be a way to go about this in a way that is multifaceted and community-driven. So since the problem can be understood as large-scale social engineering, this calls for drawing upon the information security community's practices in guarding against social engineering. So in other words, public awareness campaigns can go a long way toward alleviating the problem. And it's particularly important that members of the press are exposed to these public awareness campaigns so that they understand the problem they're dealing with. In addition, media outlets should consider new policies on how to deal with leaked information. Journalists and their editors and media outlets should practice data provenance, questioning who provided the leaked information, why did they do it, and is it ethical to publish? The idea here is that journalists should question, am I furthering some kind of nefarious narrative or agenda? So from personal experience, one thing that makes this much more difficult to have an effect on people is that when you are exposed to other cultures and perspectives, it helps you break out of your own little echo chambers, and it makes you less vulnerable. So the information operations worked on me because I had been isolated from my own perspective for long enough, and I didn't yet fully understand the Russian government's motives and perspective. Different people have different perspectives, and understanding those points of view increases the likelihood of guarding against social engineering. Спасибо за внимание. Thanks for listening. And before we get into questions, I wanted to say a huge thank you to my mentor, John Seymour, who has been fantastic. Go follow him on Twitter. And again, one small caveat before we go into questions. I'm not here to wade into partisan issues. So if you want to talk politics, let's take it outside, or you can contact me on Twitter. Thank you.
With your experience over in Russia, did you have any exposure to essentially the history behind the Ukrainian pogroms of the 1920s and 30s, where they killed 20 million Ukrainians and moved Russians in? Do you have any awareness if that's the area of the country that's directly affected?
Are you talking about the genocide by famine?
The
Yes.
genocide by famine, exactly.
Yeah.
Is that the area of the country that is affected by this, that they imported native Russian speakers in to fill the gap that was basically left when they went ahead and starved 20 million people?
Right. That's a good question. I'm afraid I don't know the exact answer to it. Yeah, it would be interesting to know. I suspect that there is at least partially a role in that. I do think also that a lot of it has to do with, again, shared Soviet history where, I mean, there's always been a lot of movement back and forth between those borders, even to this day. And especially, of course, when Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union, right? So I think a lot of it was just, these are Russian workers that were brought in to, I think actually in many cases, I know for a fact that Donetsk and Lugansk are industrialized regions. Again, those are the two easternmost regions there. So I think a lot of it has to do, in fact, with industrialization more than the famine. But that's an interesting question to look into, and I'll try to do that. So thank you.
Was Khrushchev's giving of Crimea to the Ukraine in the 1950s talking point?
Oh, absolutely. Thank you for asking. Yes. No, that was all over, all the time. I mean, you would not believe the repetitiveness of these programs. It was the same talking points over and over again. And it's like this overloading where you just start to tune it out because you've heard it so many times, and then you don't question it anymore. So
How much was the past history of the German invasion invoked as a example of what happens if we don't do something now in terms of Russia? Because I noticed that there was one slide where there was the Nazi symbol on.
Right. Yes. Thank you for pointing that out. I should have talked more about that. Yes, that was definitely. They weren't invoking fascism by mistake. It was definitely, again, very much so tied to World War II. And yes, it was fears of invasion and fears of, again, just like repeating historical memory. So this picture here is a real photograph from Crimea just before the referendum happened. You can see the translation on the screen there. So this referendum was conducted in such an unbelievably biased environment that even if there wasn't actual rigging, it would have been extremely unlikely that people would have actually voted what they really felt in reality. Today in Russia, there's a similar problem where, you can't get accurate public opinion information for the most part because, well, a lot of different reasons, but one of the most prominent ones being that people they basically tell you what they think you want to hear instead of what they actually believe. So I think there's a lot of that context that went into the vote. And does that answer your question? Okay.
I think we have time for one more question.
Yep, Meagan, so just in hindsight, if we could appreciate everything that was going to happen in Ukraine, how and at what point could, say, Ukraine or whoever else have intervened, and how would they have done that?
That is a great question. I'm afraid I don't have a very good answer for you. I think, so one thing that happened was that the UN Security Council was very slow to act on this. So on March 1st, 2014, the Russian parliament actually voted to give Putin the authority to use military force in Ukraine. And despite that, very clear signal that there was something very wrong going on. The UN Security Council didn't attempt to pass a resolution on this until March 15th, the day before this, horribly rigged referendum. So the Budapest Memorandum calls for, in event of a violation, you're supposed to seek immediate UN Security Council assistance, which I guess basically means the UN Security Council needs to pass some kind of resolution. And of course, we can talk a lot about whether or not that type of institution is really that useful, especially when Russia itself sits on the UN Security Council and undermines these votes. So they did actually fail to pass a resolution on March 15th, again, because Russia vetoed it. So it's very difficult to say there would be limited military options, that would be effective in this case. The Ukrainian military is underdeveloped in many ways. So I'm sorry, I just don't have a satisfying answer for you, but it was a lot of too little, too late, I think. Right, exactly.
All right, I think we're out of time, but thank you everybody for coming, and you can always ask questions from all of our speakers on Peerless later.